The first words of the Quran ever spoken to a human being are not on the first page. They are not on the second page, or the 10th, or the 100th. They sit near the back of the book, in the 96th chapter out of 114, most of the way through, in a place almost nobody thinks to look for a beginning. And the chapter you actually open the book with, the one every Muslim on earth recites in every unit of every prayer, was not the first thing revealed. It came later. Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely strange. Every other book you have ever held begins where it began. The first sentence the author wrote is the first sentence you read. But the Quran does not work that way at all. The order the Quran arrived in and the order the Quran is arranged in are two completely different sequences. And the earliest material, the words that came down in the very first years, sits mostly at the back. While the latest material, the verses revealed at the very end of the Prophet's life, sits mostly at the front. The book, in the roughest and most striking sense, runs backwards. So today, we are going to do something almost nobody does. We are going to lay both orders side by side, the order you read and the order it came. We are going to walk the revelation forward through time, from the first 5 verses in a cave to the last verses before the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, passed from this world, and we are going to watch, step by step, as that timeline moves in almost exactly the opposite direction to the book in your hands. And then we are going to ask the only question that matters. If the arrangement is not chronological, then what is it? Why would a book be ordered this way on purpose? Because it was on purpose. And the reason is far more interesting than a filing error. Let us start with the thing you have to hold clearly in your mind, because the entire video depends on it, and most people have never once been asked to separate these two ideas. There are 2 orders, not 1, 2. The first order is the one you know. It is the arrangement of the book itself, the sequence of the 114 chapters as they sit between the covers, from the opening chapter, Al-Fatiha, all the way to the final short chapter, An-Nas. The scholars call this Tartib al-Mushaf, the order of the written copy. This is the order you recite in. It is the order every printed Quran on earth has followed, without variation, for 14 centuries. Open a copy in Indonesia, in Morocco, in Turkey, in Chicago, and the chapters come in exactly the same sequence. This is the order. The second order is completely different, and it is invisible on the page. It is the sequence in which the revelation actually arrived, over 23 years, verse by verse, and passage by passage, as the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, received it. The scholars call this Tartib al-Nuzul, the order of descent, the order of revelation. And this order is not printed anywhere in your Quran. It is not marked in the margins. You cannot see it by reading the book front to back. It has to be reconstructed, chapter by chapter, from the reports of the companions who lived through it, and it has been studied and catalogued in the classical works of Quranic science for over 1,000 years, largely on the authority of narrations going back to the companion Ibn Abbas. One more thing before we go further. That second order, the slow arrival across 23 years, was not an accident. It was a choice. It was challenged at the time, and the Quran answered the challenge directly. The objectors asked why the whole book had not simply come down in one piece. Why the waiting? And the answer came back in Surah Al-Furqan, quoting the objection and replying in the same breath. They say, why was the Quran not sent down to him all at once? And the reply is, so that we may strengthen your heart by it, and we have spaced it out distinctly. Elsewhere, the Quran says the same of itself, that it was separated into intervals so it could be recited to people over a prolonged period, sent down gradually, on purpose. So the timeline is not incidental. The slowness was deliberate. The revelation order is not merely a fact about how the text arrived. It is part of the design, every bit as intentional as the arrangement it does not match. So there are 2 sequences, laid over the exact same text. One is the shape of the book, the other is the shape of the history. And most people have never been asked to hold these as 2 separate objects, so let me make it concrete. Think of a great composer's life work, gathered into a single published volume. There is the order the pieces were written in, running across the decades of a life, the early work and the late work in the sequence they were composed. And then there is the order they are printed in, arranged deliberately for the person who will actually sit down and play them. Both orders are completely real. They describe the very same music, but they are not the same list, and mistaking one for the other will mislead you about everything. That is the situation here, except the stakes are far higher, because one of these orders is the record of 23 years of history as it actually unfolded, and the other is the fixed form in which more than 1 billion people recite this book every single day. Both are real, both matter enormously, and most people who love this book have only ever known that one of them exists. And here is the thing that surprises people the most. These two orders are not slightly different. They are not a few chapters out of place. In their overall movement, they run in nearly opposite directions. Because the arrangement of the Mushaf follows, broadly, a principle of length, the longest chapters sit near the front, the shortest sit near the back. That is why the second chapter, Al-Baqarah, at nearly 300 verses, sits right at the beginning, and the tiny chapters of 3 and 4 and 5 verses cluster at the very end. And now, hold that next to a simple historical fact. The revelation in Mecca, in the earliest years, came down overwhelmingly in short, sharp, powerful passages, and the revelation in Medina, in the final years, came down overwhelmingly in long, detailed, legislative chapters. Do you see what that produces? Short and early, sorted to the back. Long and late, sorted to the front. The two principles pull against each other, and the result is a book whose general chronological trajectory runs from the back toward the front, while you read it from the front toward the back. Now, I want to be precise with you, because precision is the whole point of a channel like this. This is not a perfect, verse-by-verse reversal. It is not the case that chapter 114 is the oldest, and chapter 1 is the newest, tidally, all the way down. The arrangement is not a strict length ordering either, and there are Meccan chapters near the front and Medinan chapters near the back. But the overall movement, the trend across the whole book, is unmistakably inverted. The oldest material of the entire revelation is concentrated in the last third of the book. The newest material is concentrated in the first third, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it. So let us walk it. We begin where the revelation begins, in a cave on a mountain outside Mecca in the year 610. A man of about 40 years old, who could neither read nor write, has been withdrawing to this cave to be alone and to worship, away from a city full of idols. And there the angel Jibril comes to him and seizes him and commands him to read, and he says, in terror, that he is not a reader. 3 times the angel presses him, and then the words come, the first words of the Quran ever to exist in the world. Read, in the name of your Lord who created the human being from a clinging clot. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, the one who taught by the pen, taught the human being what he did not know. 5 verses, that is the beginning of everything. And the majority position among the scholars, the position held by the overwhelming weight of the tradition, is that these 5 verses of the chapter called Al-Alaq, the clinging clot, are the very first revelation. Now go and find Al-Alaq in your copy of the Quran. It is chapter 96, out of 114. You have to travel through more than 80% of the book to reach the place where the book actually started. The genesis of the entire revelation is filed near the back, a few pages from the end. In a short chapter you might read in under a minute. That single fact, all by itself, should tell you that the arrangement of this book is doing something other than telling you a story in order. And it continues. After that first encounter, the reports describe a pause, a period where no revelation came, a silence that weighed heavily on the prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him. And then the revelation resumed, and the early Meccan chapters began to come. The traditional sequence, drawn from the classical sources, places among the very earliest chapters Al-Qalam, the pen, then Al-Muzammil, the enwrapped one, then Al-Mudaththir, the cloaked one. And here I want to give you an honest note, because this channel does not smooth over the seams. There is a genuine, respectable minority position among the scholars that the first revelation was actually the opening of Al-Mudaththir, the command, O you who are cloaked, arise and warn. It is based on an authentic narration in the collections of both Al-Bukhari and Muslim, where the companion Jabir was asked which part of the Quran was revealed first and gave that answer. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, one of the greatest hadith scholars in Islamic history, noted this position in his commentary, and the scholars reconciled it beautifully. The strongest reading is that al-Alaq was the first revelation absolutely, and al-Mudaththir was the first revelation after the pause, the first command to stand up and publicly warn, first to arrive, and first to send him into the world, both true in their own lane. Now look at where all of these early chapters live in your book. Al-Qalam is chapter 68, Al-Muzammil is 73, Al-Mudaththir is 74. Every single one of them sits in the back half. The entire opening act of Islamic history, the first words, the first command, the first summons to preach, is stored in the final third of the book, and it keeps going. The early Meccan period produced a torrent of short, thunderous chapters, and almost all of them sit near the back. At Takwir, chapter 81, where the sun is wrapped up, and the stars fall, and the mountains are moved, and the earth is turned inside out on the day of judgment. Al-Allah, chapter 87, glorifying the name of the Lord Most High. Al-Layl, chapter 92. Al-Fajr, chapter 89, swearing by the dawn. Ad-Duha, chapter 93, the tender consolation revealed when the revelation had paused, and the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, feared he had been abandoned, telling him that his Lord had neither forsaken him nor grown to hate him. Ash-Shar, chapter 94, the promise that with hardship comes ease. Al-Asr, chapter 103, the tiny chapter swearing by time itself. Read that list again and notice what you are looking at. 81, 87, 89, 92, 93, 94, 103. The earliest years of the revelation, the foundation of everything, are almost entirely located in the last quarter of the book you hold. And these early chapters have a character you can feel immediately. They are short. Their verses are short. They are rhythmic and urgent, built to be memorized quickly by a persecuted minority who might have to carry them in their chests rather than on paper. They swear great oaths by the sun and the night and the dawn. They hammer on the fundamentals, that God is one, that the resurrection is real, that a day of judgment is coming, that the arrogant will answer for how they treated the weak. They almost never legislate. They address all of humanity, calling out, "O mankind," because in Mecca there was no community yet, no state, no law to give. There was only the human being asked the largest question there is, "Who is your Lord?" And the form fit the moment exactly. These were people under real pressure. The early Muslims in Mecca were a mocked, hunted minority with no state, no army, and no protection. One of them, an enslaved man named Bilal, was dragged into the desert at the hottest hour and pinned under a boulder until he renounced the one God, and all he would say, crushed under the stone, was one word, over and over, one. For a community living like that, revelation could not arrive as long legal treatises. It came as short, blazing passages that could be memorized in an afternoon and carried in the chest where nobody could confiscate them. The shape of the early revelation is the shape of a message built to survive persecution. This is the first half of the timeline, 13 years of it, and it is sitting at the back of your book. If you are following this, if the shape of it is starting to click into place, let me ask you for one small thing, because on a channel like this, it genuinely matters. Take 1 second and tap the like button. It is a tiny action, but it is the clearest possible signal that tells the platform to hand this to the next person who has read this book their whole life without ever being shown that it does not run in the order they assumed. And if you want to keep taking the Quran apart like this, structure by structure, subscribe and stay with us, because this is exactly the work we do here. So here's a real question for the comments, and I read them. Did you know, before today, that the first revelation sits at chapter 96? Tell me honestly below. Now let us cross the great divide and watch the second half of the timeline. Because in the year 622, everything changes. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, hunted and facing an assassination plot, leaves Mecca in secret and migrates north to the city that will become Medina. That migration is called the Hijra, and it is such a hinge in history that the entire Muslim calendar counts from it. And on the other side of it, the revelation changes its voice. Because now there is a community, then a society, then a state. And a state has questions that a persecuted minority never had to ask. How is an inheritance divided? What are the rules of marriage and divorce? How do we handle a debt, a contract, a treaty, a war, a crime? Who gets the charity and how much? And the revelation turns to answer them at length. So the Medinan chapters are long. Their verses are long, patient, detailed, legal. They address the believers directly, calling out, "O you who believe," because now there is a defined community to speak to. They deal with hypocrisy, a phenomenon that barely existed in Mecca, because in Mecca, nobody pretended to be a Muslim, since being one could get you tortured. They engage in extended dialogue with the other scriptural communities of the city, and they legislate, verse after verse after verse. To feel the contrast, take one example. The longest single verse in the entire Quran sits in Al-Baqarah, and it is about writing down a loan. It instructs the believers that when they contract a debt for a fixed term, they should put it in writing, and that a scribe should record it justly, and that the one who owes should dictate the terms and not diminish anything from what he owes. And it continues into witnesses, and what to do if the debtor is unable to dictate, and how to handle a transaction conducted on the spot. It is careful, procedural, almost administrative. Now hold that beside the early Meccan revelation, where the verses are 4 or 5 words long and swear by the dawn and the night and the racing horses. It hardly sounds like the same book. But it is, and the difference is not a change of author, it is a change of situation. The first passages were forming belief in the hearts of the persecuted. The later passages were running a society for people who already believed. First the foundation, then the building. Now here is where the inversion lands with full force. Look at where those Medinan chapters sit. The very first chapter revealed after the migration, according to the traditional chronology, is Al-Baqarah, the cow. It is the longest chapter in the entire Quran, nearly 300 verses, sprawling across law and history and prayer and warfare and debt. In the order of revelation, it is somewhere around the 87th chapter to arrive, 87th out of 114. It is late material, deep into the timeline, more than 15 years after that first night in the cave. And where does it sit in your book? Chapter 2, second from the front, the first thing you read after the opening prayer. Hold those two numbers next to each other, because they are the whole video in miniature. Al-Alaq, the first revelation, is chapter 96. Al-Baqarah, revealed roughly 86 chapters later, is chapter 2. The beginning is at the back. The late material is at the front. That is the inversion, stated as plainly as it can be stated. And it is not just Al-Baqarah. Look at the whole front section of your Quran. Al-Imran, chapter 3, Medinan. An-Nisa, chapter 4, Medinan, the great chapter of family law and inheritance. Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, Medinan, and among the very last chapters revealed of all. Al-Anfal, chapter 8, Medinan, revealed around the Battle of Badr. At-Tawbah, chapter 9, Medinan, and by most accounts, one of the final chapters to come down. So, the opening stretch of the book you read, chapters 2 through 9, the material you meet first, the passages you encounter before almost anything else, are drawn overwhelmingly from the final decade of the revelation. You begin your reading at the end of the story. And then, if you keep going, you travel through the middle of the book and out toward the back, and the further you go, the older the material gets, until you arrive in the final quarter and find yourself standing in the earliest days of Mecca, among the first words that were ever spoken to a man in a cave who could not read. You read the book from its end to its beginning. That is what is meant when we say the Quran was revealed backwards. So now, the question: if the arrangement is not chronological, if it deliberately scrambles the timeline, then who set this order and why? And the first thing to say is that this order is old and it is fixed. Since the standardized copies were distributed in the time of the Caliph Uthman, may God be pleased with him, every single copy of the Quran, everywhere in the world, in every century since, has carried the chapters in this same sequence, beginning with Al-Fatiha and ending with An-Nas. There is no rival arrangement in circulation. That level of unbroken uniformity across 1400 years and every continent is remarkable by itself. As for who said it, this is a real scholarly discussion, and I am going to give it to you honestly, because the disagreement is genuinely interesting, and hiding it would be a disservice. The majority position, held by a great many scholars, is that the order is tawqifi. That word means fixed by divine instruction, taught by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him himself, and not a human editorial decision. The early scholar, Abu Ja'far al-Nahas, put it about as bluntly as it can be put. He said, "The order of the chapters is from God and his messenger, without the involvement of anyone else, and the evidence they marshal is substantial." The companions, who disagreed with each other about plenty of things, unanimously agreed on this arrangement, which is difficult to explain if it were merely one person's editorial preference. There are reports of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, reciting several chapters together in their established sequence. And most compellingly, there is the annual review. It is recorded that every year during Ramadan, the angel Jibril would go through the entire revelation with the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in what the scholars call the Mu'aradah, the presentation. And in the final year of his life, that review happened twice. Now, think about what a review even means. You cannot review a text in a sequence unless there is a sequence to review it in. The annual rehearsal of the whole Quran with the angel who brought it presupposes a settled order, confirmed and reconfirmed, right up to the end of the Prophet's life. But honesty requires the other side, and there is one. This is a well-known difference of opinion, recorded in the great classical works of Quranic science, in Al-Zarkashi's Al-Burhan and Al-Suyuti's Al-Itqan. A minority of scholars held that while the order of verses within each chapter was certainly fixed by instruction, the arrangement of the chapters relative to one another involved the considered judgment of the companions. The disagreement is old, it is respectable on both sides, and the scholars who debated it were not being careless, they were being careful. They refused to overstate what the evidence would bear. And that same carefulness shows up in an even more striking place, which brings us to one of the most interesting disagreements in the whole field. What was the last thing revealed? You might assume this is settled. It is not, and the reason is fascinating. 3 different answers all have serious classical backing. The first is a verse in Al-Baqarah, verse 281, which tells the believers to fear a day when they will be returned to God, when every soul will be paid in full for what it earned, and none will be wronged. This is reported from Ibn Abbas, and Ibn Hajar considered it the soundest view. The reports say the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, lived only about 9 days after it came down. The second is a verse in Al-Ma'idah, verse 3, the tremendous declaration revealed at Arafah during the farewell pilgrimage. "This day I have perfected for you your religion, and completed my favor upon you, and approved for you Islam as a religion." Many scholars pointed to this as the final word, and you can see why. It sounds like an ending. It announces completion. And the third is an entire chapter. An-Nasr, chapter 110, 3 short verses about the help of God arriving and the victory coming, and people entering the religion in crowds, closing with a command to glorify your Lord and seek his forgiveness. In the traditional chronological ordering, this chapter sits last of all, and there is a poignant report that when the companion Ibn Abbas was asked about it, he understood it as a signal that the Prophet's own time was drawing to a close, that the mission was complete and the return was near. So which one is it? And here the scholars did something elegant rather than forcing a fight. They noticed that the 3 claims are answering 3 different questions. One is the last verse revealed absolutely, on any subject at all. Another is the last verse of legislation, the final ruling and the announcement of completion. And the third is the last complete chapter to be revealed as a single unit. All 3 can be true at once, because they are 3 different categories. The apparent contradiction dissolves the moment you notice that the companions were each preserving a different kind of last. And that tells you something important about the people who transmitted this book. They did not smooth it over. They did not quietly pick one answer and bury the others to make the record look tidier. They preserved all 3 reports, with their chains, for 1400 years, and let the scholars work it out in the open. A tradition inventing a clean story does not leave this many honest seams showing. So we come back to the real question, the one under everything. Why? Why arrange a book against its own chronology? And the answer, once you see it, reframes the entire thing. The Quran is not arranged chronologically because it was never meant to be a diary. A diary is a record of what happened to its author, in order, and its purpose is to preserve a sequence. But the Quran does not present itself as a record of the past. It presents itself as a direct address to the reader, right now, in the present tense. It is not telling you what happened to somebody 23 years running. It is speaking to you. And a book meant to be recited, memorized, prayed with, and lived inside does not need to be filed by date. It needs to be arranged the way it will actually be used. So look at what the arrangement actually does. It opens with Al-Fatiha, a short prayer for guidance, which functions as a doorway you step through before entering. Then, it hands you Al-Baqarah, the longest, most comprehensive chapter, dense with the law and the history and the practice of a complete way of life, right at the front, where a reader beginning a lifetime with this book most needs it. The front-loading of the Medinan material is not an accident of length. It puts the fully developed guidance of a mature community in the hands of a reader on day one. And then, as you move deeper, the chapters shorten and intensify and burn down to the foundations until you finish among the short, blazing early chapters about God's oneness and the Day of Judgment, and close the book on 2 brief prayers for refuge. That is not a timeline, that is a curriculum. And a curriculum is arranged for the student, not for the historian. A history of medicine would begin with the earliest theories and walk you forward through the centuries. A medical textbook does not do that. It begins with what a practitioner most needs to know, and it is organized for use, not for chronology. Nobody accuses a textbook of being disordered because it fails to follow the sequence of discovery. It is following a different logic entirely, a logic aimed at the person holding it. That is the logic of the Mushaf. It is not organized around what happened first. It is organized around the human being who is going to spend a lifetime reciting it. But do not walk away thinking the revelation order is therefore just a curiosity, a piece of trivia with no use. It is nothing of the kind. It is one of the standard working tools of Quranic scholarship, and it has been for 1,000 years. Knowing when a passage arrived tells you what situation it was answering, which is the entire discipline the scholars call Asbab al-Nuzul, the occasions of revelation. It is essential for questions of abrogation, where a later ruling refines or replaces an earlier one, because you cannot know which came later without knowing the sequence. It shapes how jurists derive law. And it lets you watch the pedagogy of the revelation unfold, the way belief was established first and obligation came second, which is a lesson in how to teach anything to anyone. So, the 2 orders are not rivals. They are 2 instruments for 2 different jobs. The order of the Mushaf is for recitation and for living. The order of revelation is for understanding. The mistake is not using one of them. The mistake is not knowing the other one exists. And notice something else the arrangement protects. Because the order is not chronological, no part of this book can be quietly retired as belonging only to the past. If the Quran were arranged as a historical record, it would be very easy to treat the early chapters as an old phase and the later ones as the current one, to read it as a story that finished. Instead, the periods are woven together, early beside late, Mecca beside Medina, the foundations of belief sitting a few pages from the details of law. It is all held in one living present. The book resists being turned into history. We have really only opened the door here, because each of these chapters carries its own moment, its own occasion of revelation, its own reason it came down exactly when it did. In a future video, I want to take a single chapter and place it precisely in its moment, and show you how much the meaning deepens when you know what was happening the day it arrived. That is where this is going next, so make sure you are subscribed and the bell is on so you do not miss it. But before we close, sit with the reflection this whole thing has been building toward. You have been reading your entire life, a book that hands you the end of the story first, and there is something quietly merciful in that, because it means you did not have to earn your way to the guidance. You were not made to walk the full 23 years of struggle and persecution before you were given the answers. The community that lived through that revelation received it slowly, one hard-won piece at a time, across a lifetime of difficulty. You were handed all of it, complete, on the first page, in the order best suited to a person who has to live by it. Everything they waited years for is sitting in your hands right now, arranged for your benefit, before you have done anything at all to deserve it. And the last thing to notice is where the two orders finally agree. Follow the revelation forward through time, and it ends, in every one of the three accounts we walk through, at the same place. A reminder of the day you return to God. A declaration that the religion is complete. A command to praise your Lord and seek His forgiveness, because the mission is finished and the return is near. And follow the arrangement of the book instead, front to back, and it ends with two short prayers for refuge, a human being turning to their Lord and asking to be kept safe. Two completely different orders, the same destination. However you read this book, forwards through the arrangement or backwards through the history, it puts you in exactly the same place at the end. Standing before your Lord, asking Him for shelter, reminded that you are going home to Him. That is not the shape of a diary, that is the shape of a summons. And the fact that the summons was placed in your hands complete, in the order that serves you best, before you asked for it and before you earned it, is itself a mercy you were never charged for. So the next time you open this book, remember what you are actually holding. Not a record of what happened. A book arranged, deliberately, for the person reading it. The beginning is at the back, the ending is at the front, and every page of it, in whichever direction you travel, is pointing you toward the same door. It was ordered this way for you. All that is left is to walk in.